Hi folks, and welcome back to Quarantine According to Eddie. It's about 4:15 on the 20th of June, and I'm doing a request video today. I've been asked to talk a bit about Hegelianism, created by George William Friedrich Hegel in the Enlightenment period. And it felt like a good challenge, a bit different, and actually something that's quite appropriate at the moment, because it was Hegel who came up with the idea of the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. And considering so much is happening within our time, and collectively we have a very particular perhaps social spirit at the moment, however you want to look at it, Hegelianism seems to be certainly an interesting thing to consider at this stage. Now, Hegel is notorious for being really difficult to understand, and his books they're very hard work. So I'm going to try and put out some of his basic ideas, some of the more important stuff. I am going to have a few notes with me because, as I said, this is complex stuff, so I've got a few things to refer to, so I might sort of be looking down a little bit, but hopefully I can get this idea of Hegel's idealism and his idea of the collective spirit and the zeitgeist across to you today. Now, George Hegel was an idealist, which puts him in the same camp as Immanuel Kant, George Berkeley, who I've mentioned in a very early video, and going all the way back to Plato. And they are opposed to the ideas of the materialists. The materialists believe everything exists within the material world. The idealists believe that there is more beyond the material world, a world of ideals, if you like. That's putting it very, very basically. This is sort of the background to where Hegel was coming from. And his idea was kind of like a more extreme version of Kant's in many ways that underpinned this. That rationalism, pure rationalism, will explain everything within the world. Now Kant, although you might think that that's where Kant was coming from, he actually, in his book, A Critique of Pure Reason, accepted that pure reason on its own wasn't perfect. But Hegel believed that if you had just pure thought process alone, you would be able to categorize and understand reality entirely. And he thought that you could do this via a dialectic. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And you use logic for this. But unlike some of the more rationalist philosophers, Hegel believed that evidence was important. Because although evidence, empirical evidence, is flawed, you have to use your senses, and you're only really getting a virtual interpretation of the world through your senses. He did accept that actually logic on its own is too abstract. You need to have evidence as well. But you can apply rationalism to it. So you come up with an idea, that's your thesis, and then someone comes along and pokes holes in it. And this is the antithesis. This is the opposite of the thesis. Now at the moment this sounds quite a lot like the Socratic method, come up with an idea and it gets critiqued. So it would be something like, if I would say, I think tea is the best drink. Someone would come along and say, well, other people have different opinions, and they'd say that coffee is the best drink. Then you come to a synthetic statement, which is where you bring these two ideas together to create a new truth. At which point you go, okay, well maybe hot drinks are the best drinks. And then that becomes the new thesis, and the process goes on. So in terms of his thinking, it was very much along that kind of rationalist route that that you see in Kant, that you see, and again in Plato as well, this idea of logical rational thinking being the way to achieve truth. Now Hegel went a little bit further than most and suggested that our perceptions of the world are flawed not just because of our senses, which are imperfect, but because we also are socialized. Our society and our social consciousness depends on the context that we're in. And that influences the way that we see things. So our virtual world isn't just skewed by our senses, it's also skewed by our social understanding as well. And he talks about the way in which societies have a collective understanding of themselves and of reality. And he believed that this collective understanding existed in a different world, in a different plane, kind of like Plato's world of forms. That there was this immaterial world in which the collective spirit existed, and the collective spirit is something that sort of has been developed by humanity, but is a part of humanity. So we've evolved, and we started off just by using our senses and getting sense data and information. But as we become more and more complex, and our societies have developed, this spirit has developed at the same time, and this spirit is known as the Geist. And the Geist exists in a different plane. It's a part of everyone. Everyone contributes to it. Everyone brings their bit into it, but it exists within everyone. And the Geist grows and changes, and it's different at different points in time. So at any point in time, the Geist has a very particular way of being. The collective attitude of a society will be like this at one point, like this at another point, and it keeps on growing, and eventually it will become something perfect. Everything will become something perfect eventually, according to Hegel. Much like if you're looking at a table, it was a tree, now it's a table, and it will become ashes. That's the example that he used, because everyone burns their tables. And he thought it was more important that there was this process towards becoming, so what the ideal will be, rather than what it is at the moment. Anyway, slight tangent on that one, but the point is that society is the same. So the Geist is developing towards its perfection, it's getting there, but there are these points in time that you can sort of look and go, okay, that's what the Geist was like. And at any given moment, the way that the Geist is known as the Zeitgeist, the way that the collective spirit is at the time. Now, of course, in modern parlance, the Zeitgeist is like the mood of the time, or the feeling of the time. But it kind of ties into this Hegelian idea that our collective understanding is in a particular way, in a particular form, at a particular time. So the Geist can only really be achieved when people become self-conscious, because the whole idea is that you have to be conscious of the fact that you are a part of a whole of society, and you have to be able to reflect on your position within that whole. And self-consciousness was very important to Hegel. Unlike a lot of Enlightenment thinkers who were really more interested in the individual, individualists like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, who thought, the individual is a subject who looks at objects and understands them. Hegel took it a stage further and said, yeah, but a subject also looks on other subjects, and in turn, those subjects look back on you. And that's where self-consciousness comes from. The idea that you realise other people are looking at you and perceiving you, and so you start to perceive yourself. And once you perceive yourself as part of this whole, and you realise your position within this whole, that's when the Geist starts to develop, because you realise you have responsibilities, and you have a position within this Geist and within this society as part of society's constant development, part of this becoming. You have a role to play. And he used the idea that the spirit, like all things, is growing, it's becoming, and it's there to preserve our freedom. So we are aware and we're free. We make our own free choices, but it also affirms the ties that we have to other people. And he used the example of the lord and the bondsman. So a lord being someone in high society, and a bondsman being somewhere in low society. The bondsman is self-conscious of their position below the lord, and so they sacrifice their own freedom and individual freedoms in order to satisfy the needs of the lord, because that's what society demands. And this is unsatisfying because it's a sacrifice of the freedom. It's not going with the full actualization, the full becoming of the spirit, of the Geist. Because the Geist is saying, you should be free, and you should have your communal bonds, but you should have your liberty as well. So it's holding the Geist back, this social fabric. And the Lord, superficially, is very, very happy, because the bondsman is looking after the Lord and providing this. But really the Lord, somewhere in the subconscious, or possibly even the conscious, will feel awkward and feel uncomfortable, because the Lord will know that in order to achieve what the Lord wants, what he wants, the bondsman has to be sacrificed. And that in itself is harming the Geist, because while the Lord has individuality and freedom, the bonds to fellow society members are harmed. And this holds the Geist back from its full becoming as well, meeting its ideal potential. And this is really important because it suggests that in order for the Geist to truly develop its becoming, people have to act socially, collectively, but also in a manner that is responsible for each other. So business practices should be ethical, people should look after each other, try to treat each other equally. Now, it doesn't take a genius to work out why it is that Marx was a big fan of Hegel, and Marxism borrowed a lot from these ideas. So this is quite relevant to what we're seeing at the moment in our society, and you could argue that our Zeitgeist, the time of our spirit, is one where we are sort of making steps towards this idea of becoming, if we're following Hegel's ideas, in that we're looking to try to treat people better, or like the large parts of society are trying to treat people better, right the wrongs of the past, and trying to improve and work towards this collective idea. And it does seem that society progresses generally towards this ideal of people being more equal, people being treated more fairly. So it does support Hegel's ideas. And we've had some real sort of Zeitgeist moments that would suggest that Hegel's idealism has got some merit towards it. That we are working towards this ideal. But there are plenty of weaknesses to Hegel's ideas as well. Most notably, there are a lot of criticisms, but the most notable ones would be, much like Plato and anyone who believes in another realm, he can't prove it empirically. And it runs into the same problem as the world of forms, and things like that. It's like Bertrand Russell's teapot all over again. Bertrand Russell could say that there's a teapot on the far side of the moon that nobody can ever see. He can't prove it. The person who makes the claim has to be able to prove it. It's not up to others to disprove it. It's up to the person who suggests it to prove it. And Hegel can't really prove it. If you think from like a sort of a David Hume skepticism kind of way, you can't prove empirically that this spirit is there. And it's an inductive leap to suggest just because society has been this way, firstly, that it will continue that way. Society could veer off in a different direction. Secondly, that just because society has developed this way, that there is a causation for it. There may be a correlation to it, but there may not be a causation. We can't prove these things beyond doubt. So Hegel's suggestions are based a lot in sort of theory and conjecture, but there's not really the evidence provided to back it up, the empirical evidence. Also, he relies that much on reason that, even Kant accepted that pure reason would only get you so far, hence his book, A Critique of Pure Reason. This is Kant we're talking about, a guy who loved reason. So, the fact that Hegel is trying to use this idea that reason is the way forward, and that's the final gold standard for achieving truth. Get into all the detail here, but it runs into all the classic rationalist problems as well. And you could also argue that aside from the fact that this idea of the Geist and this idea of collective responsibility is all, aside from the fact that there's no real evidence for it, there is also plenty of evidence that actually society and humanity kind of moves on, not through collective responsibility and everyone being really nice to each other, but actually from more of a kind of survival of the fittest approach, more Darwinian, that it's people fighting each other, it's people out-competing each other. And even if it's only, rather than individuals out-competing each other, it's societies, tribes out-competing each other. And that's how we survive. It's a more bleak view, and it's the view of people like, say, Darwin, to an extent. Dawkins, certainly. Not without its own criticisms, but we're talking about Hegel here, so I won't go into that. But it's a legitimate criticism that would need addressing. So that's a really brief overview of Hegelian philosophy, and a bit of an indication as to how it links in to modern times. I hope, for the person who asked for this video, that that's given you a bit to think about, and that you're happy with my potted explanation of it. But for anyone, of course, as usual, any questions or comments, feel free to leave them. Get in touch. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.